Humility. If you're a human being, you have ego. This is a Lego. Ego is the root of all evil. It stops you from learning. It stops you from building the best product. And in general, it gets in the way. If you're new in your career, let's say you have under 3 years of experience, you have a lot to prove, right? When you first enter Hogwarts, nobody has expectations of you. And the reality is when you're fresh out of college, dude, you do not know anything. All of what you learn in college has no translation to actual software development. After about 1 year, you start to realize, okay, you know what? I got my footing. You've contributed to your team in some way, I'd assume, at 1 year. You start to feel like you have your shit together, at least a little bit. This is when the ego really starts to form. And for some people, it continues, and for some people, it stagnates. For the people that it continues with, you often find these people don't make it far. Because if, as I mentioned earlier, you stop learning, how are you going to get better? If your ego gets in the way of building the best product, how are you going to advance your career? For the people that it stagnates with, quickly, they stay in a growth mindset. This is where you want to be. Now there's an article I want to go through because I think it really embodies this. It's an article written by Kong Wang, and it starts by saying, I am a software engineer and I used to enjoy arguing with people for technical correctness. Right? There's nothing funner on this earth, unfortunately, than arguing. If you watch any YouTube video out there or any article, even this article itself, most of the content ends up being in a negative tone because agreeing is boring. There's nothing to say. If I agree with everything you say, I'm just going to say, oh, it looks good to me. But if I have something that I disagree with, I'm going to go into depth. He goes on to say, code reviews, design meetings, mailing list threads, dinner tables. If someone was wrong, I wanted them to know it, and I wanted them to know exactly why. I collected counter arguments the way I collected patches. I believe that if I just laid out the logic clearly enough, the other person would have absolutely no choice but to come around, and truth would win. If you're honest with yourself, I think you can see this in yourself. As I mentioned before, you know, when you're fresh out of college, maybe you start off in the foot of, hey, I don't know what the hell's going on, and you're worried, but very quickly your ego gets a hold of yourself. He goes on to say, it almost never worked that way. Sometimes I won in points and lost the person. More often, I won on nothing at all. I'd watch someone grow more certain of the very thing I had just disproven, while the room quietly drifted to their side. Right? If all you do is take the stance of ego, this is what you end up with. There's a lot of people that have this. And you probably have a coworker that you're familiar with. They always have whataboutisms. They always say, actually. And guess what? You really do not want to hang out with this person. And before we continue, do not take this to say that disagreeing is bad, because it's not. Disagreeing is good if done correctly. Let's say an engineer says something you disagree with. There's two ways to handle this, right? You could either say, actually, completely disregard his viewpoint and go on your own tangent about how TypeScript is better. Now, while this might be true in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter. The right way to handle it is to say, why do you feel that way? Ask a question. People do not do this very often early on in their career. And the ones that I look up to personally, I find do this all the time. There's an engineer on my team. He's been at it for probably 20 years. Anytime I'm in a situation where I'm like, what do? I think about what would this guy do? And even after 20 years of experience, this guy always asks me questions. And so I'll come to him with the most absurd question of all time. And instead of completely dismissing it, I always end up with a question. What do you think, right? You would think this question is so simple. And really, you know, you go through all this time period of just explaining your question, and he comes back to you with a question, and then all of a sudden you're floored. Talking about what do I think? You're a 20-year engineer. You should just tell me what to do. But as I've grown older in my career, I started to realize what this really was. Now, obviously, everyone has an ego, but there's a level to the ego, right? If we view this as the ego meter, you need to have some ego. Don't get me wrong. If you have zero ego, you'll never get shit done. And so if we view this as no ego, some ego, high ego. If you're in the camp of no ego, guess what? You never get shit done because you think my work isn't good enough. Someone else could do it better. And so nothing happens. You never contribute, you never speak up in meetings, and you end up behind in your career. If you have some ego, you start off with the preposition, I think I could do a good job. I think my approach makes sense, right? This is what leads you to contribute, and this is what leads you to start really anything in your career. If you're in a high ego place, you're thinking, I'm the only one who can do this job. Everyone else is wrong. This is a high ego state. This is where you do not want to be. Whenever somebody's saying of an opinion that you disagree with, you should always start with a question. Why do you feel that way? Getting back to the article. Over the years, I've slowly stopped arguing. Not because I stopped caring about being right, but because I finally understood what an argument actually is and what it can and cannot do. Here is what changed my mind. So we're going to go into his mindset shift here. He starts by saying, being correct is not always good. As an engineer, this feels like heresy. And it does, right? School conditions you. One thing you can say about school It conditions you to think about things as a correct or incorrect. We go through all of our college years preparing for an exam that has right or wrong answers, and this puts us in a mindset where we feel it's either right or it's either wrong. And obviously we all want to be part of the correct camp. And when you're thrusted into the workforce, you start to realize there is somewhat of a middle ground there, and it's very hard to adapt to. And he goes on to say, the correctness is the whole job, but correctness in a fact is not the same as goodness in a moment. So let's see what he means by this. He says Lao Tzu saw this 2,500 years ago in chapter 2 of the Tao Te Ching. Being a non-being, create each other. Hard and easy, complete each other. Long and short, define each other. High and low, depend on each other. And sound and silence, harmonize each other. And it kind of alludes to what I mentioned earlier, where there is a balance. The reality is nobody is perfect at everything. Even if you're a smart guy, you have a high IQ, you're just in general a smart guy, there's no chance that you know every facet of everything. One example of this is a low-level programmer and a high-level programmer. And when I say high-level, let's assume, front end versus back end, that kind of a thing. These are two different skill sets, really. Right? The high level is more thinking about the user experience, what the user is interacting with, something at that level, whereas the low level is more thinking about keeping things not going in flames, the infrastructure. If somebody on your team has, say, 10,000 hours doing this task, and you have 10,000 hours doing this task, how absurd is it if you go to this guy and you give opinions and disregard his when it comes to low level? It sounds absurd, right? And so good things come from being in the middle here, where when the low level wants advice or opinions about the high level, he doesn't assume he knows more just because he's an expert in this side, right? He comes into the middle here and he says, hey, how do you feel about this? When the high level guy is interacting with maybe an API and he has all of his years of experience working with user experience, he's gonna come in the middle and he's gonna say, hey, how do you feel about doing it this way? That's the ideal here. That's how you achieve a good product. And so when this says, hard and easy complete each other, long and short define each other, this is basically saying two parts make a whole. But if you have a big ego, you're not seeing it that way, right? A big ego of somebody who's in the low-level state is going to assume this high-level guy is an idiot. He's going to completely disregard the 10,000 hours this guy put in working on that specific thing and think that he knows better. It's kind of like if somebody spent their whole life as a track runner and they all of a sudden decided they want to go into lunging. Both of these are physical tasks, but just because you are good at this motion does not mean you're going to be good at this motion, right? There are some things that transfer, certain things like natural ability, absolutely, and that goes here too, right? There are some people that are just naturally gifted when it comes to design and product focus. But to assume that the 10,000 hours this person spent in low level doesn't make them an authority is to completely disregard other people's capabilities and human capabilities, right? That's putting you at this high ego state where you just assume that you're the one that knows everything, and the 10,000 hours this person spent is just for nothing because they're not as good as you. It's a terrible mindset. And so let's get his interpretation. So he goes on to say, everything exists only in relation to its opposite. There is no right without a wrong to make it right. And the moment you insist on standing on high ground, you created the low ground somebody else must stand on. Winning an argument manufactures a loser. Being visibly correct manufactures someone visibly wrong. And unfortunately, this is very true, right? If you've ever been in an argument with somebody, you'll realize there is no winning. Even in this example I gave earlier of this, 20 years of experience engineer, he knows that. He knows that if he gives his opinion, at the end of the day, I'm gonna go with what I believe is the right choice. He might be able to have some influence over that choice, but at the end of the day, I am the one making the choice. And if you've ever watched a presidential debate or anything where it's an argument, you realize there is literally no winning. It'll go on forever because everyone has an ego. And I'm no saint in this, don't get me wrong. There are times, and I've found myself doing this throughout my career, where I thought I knew best, and I completely disregarded the 10,000 hours that somebody spent in a different facet, and it's cost me a lot of great opportunities and a lot of good relationships. But over time, and I'm sure this 20-year-old engineer, he probably had this experience too, over time you develop a sense of reality. So he goes on to say, so being right is not a pure good floating in space. It's a half of a pear, and it drags its opposite along with it. Once I stopped treating correctness as an absolute, I stopped needing to win. And this is hard to do, don't get me wrong. I think nobody that's a human being can completely secede an argument. You can be the nice guy that agrees to everybody, but dude, that would be a terrible life, right? You need to disagree with people in some ways. But it's how you disagree that matters. Anyway, let's go on. He goes on to say, most arguments are about ego, not ideas. When you argue with someone, you think you're debating an idea. Often, you're not. You're challenging their sense of self. Many people are ego-driven. I would say all people are ego-driven. Their opinions aren't positions they hold. They are the position. And I think we all feel this way, right? When somebody disagrees with what we say, oftentimes we attribute that as them viewing us negatively, when in reality, they are targeting our opinion. He goes on to say, prove the idea wrong and you haven't corrected a fact, you've attacked a person, right? This is how we perceive it. So they defend it the way anyone defends themselves, not with reason, but with resistance. The stronger your argument, the harder they dig in. Even at a layman term, like if you've ever, I'm sure you watching this have had a girlfriend before, and if you haven't yet, you're a lucky guy. But dude, there are such things as unwinnable battles, right? What do you want to eat? I don't even ask this question because there's no point, right? You're gonna end up in a state of absolute turmoil. Should we do this or that, right? These are very basic things that end up in endless arguments. And it gets to a point where you are no longer arguing about the thing, you're arguing about being right. People love being right. Nobody wants to be wrong. There's a certain dopamine you get when you're right. There's this article here from a psychology website that kind of goes into this, right? How winning feels good. This is an actual psychological thing that goes through our brain. We do not want to lose arguments, and when we win one, or at least how we feel we won one, we feel good. He goes on to say, you can't win an argument like this because it was never an argument. It was a fight over whose ego stays intact. Even when you win, you lose, because now you have an enemy who is more convinced than before. And so I've drawn a line. I only discuss pros and cons with smart people. Now this is where I kind of come to this article with a different lens, but I want to read the rest of this paragraph first. And so he says, I don't argue right and wrong with ego-driven ones. With the first kind, a disagreement is a joint search for the better answer, and both of us walk away sharper. With the second, there is no answer being sought, only a self to be defended. Knowing which conversation you're in is half the battle. The other half is having the discipline to walk away from the second one. Now where I disagree with this on, as we discussed, disagreeing is so fun, right? But that is what makes us human. The part I disagree with is the assumption that there is such thing as a non-ego driven person. This 20 years of experienced engineer, even if we go down the argument and we eventually end up with me saying, oh, I'm gonna do it this way that I had already planned, that does not mean he agrees with me. And that does not mean he walked away sharper, right? He might fully disagree with my approach, but this guy, he will never beat a dead horse. He'll often give some feedback to it. But best believe, I know some of the stuff I've told this guy, he's like, dude, that is not the right way to do it. That's not how I would do it. But you're a young engineer and you're gonna learn one way or the other. Part of what I think he's getting at here though, is that it's important to identify when you're arguing for ego and when you're arguing just for the actual idea itself. At the end of the day, for an argument to work like this, somebody has to stifle their ego, right? I think when everyone enters an argument, they start off kind of up towards the middle, top here, maybe even higher. And oftentimes I've seen it to where in an argument, somebody will clearly be wrong. Like they will hit every point, they'll miss every point. Like envision this as RuneScape and their HP is just going down to 0, but they never stop. They continue to, stand with their argument. But then after the dust settles and the ego effect is gone, then they start to change their ways, right? They think, oh, you know what? Maybe I was wrong about this. Maybe we should go with this path. But that didn't matter in the moment. Oftentimes the arguments you get into, it's two people that refuse to stifle their ego, and so it goes on and on and on and on. And typically when you leave the argument, in your head you think, oh, somebody won. No, nobody wins. Like this article saying, nobody wins. Both people walk away. Someone eventually gets bored and decides to walk away. But that doesn't mean that they actually agreed with your opinion. That just means that they were bored. They were tired of talking to you. But unfortunately, the ideal here doesn't really exist. This idea of identifying which is which and walking away, it doesn't exist. Everyone's argument is ego-driven. There's no such thing as a non-ego-driven argument. This 20 years of experienced engineer, he is good at stifling his ego and allowing people to be wrong or go against his opinion. But that does not mean it wasn't an ego-driven point of view. Right, at some point you need to just let the guy take the wheel. And so he goes on to say, people are not rational. We like to believe humans are rational animals who occasionally feel emotions. It's the reverse. We are emotional animals who occasionally think. This is absolutely true. Most people don't reason their way to conclusions and then feel accordingly. They feel first and then reason backwards to justify their feeling. They follow the crowd, mistake confidence for correctness, and adopt whatever the people around them already have. Independent thinking is rare, far rarer than we admit. Once you accept this, arguing with logic starts to look absurd. You're bringing a proof to a feeling. The proof is airtight, the feeling doesn't read. Kind of taking a higher power here and saying independent thinking is rare, far rarer than we admit. I don't think there's a human being on this planet Earth that is capable of this completely. The real thing to realize here is that everyone has this ego, and you're always going to end up in arguments where you disagree, but sometimes you just need to realize there's nothing you can do. He continues, correcting others rarely helps them. But my motivation is good, you say. I'm not attacking anyone, I'm just pointing out a mistake so they don't get hurt. I think we all know people like this, especially when it comes to meetings. Right, you have people that take the approach of correcting then and there, and then you have the people that take the approach of correcting after. When you start having people that you are mentoring, you really come to realize that the importance of this part. Because if you make a mistake and you do this in front of the entire meeting, that person is forever going to resent you. I'm sure we've all had this, right? Where somebody corrected us or really, made us feel like an idiot in front of other people. Maybe you said something wrong or maybe something wasn't technically accurate, whatever. Everyone has mistakes in this way. And when they do it this way, where it's right then and there, your ego is hit. When they do it this way, trust and believe your ego is still hit, but not nearly as much, right? The ego is hit in the way that you are wrong, and I don't think anyone likes feeling wrong, but it doesn't sit with you. And over time, you start to realize, oh, at least they pulled me aside and did it that way. And so one piece of advice I always give is to do it this way. Even, obviously there's times where you do need to correct right then and there, but you should get better at handling it, right? If you're gonna do it this way, where you're gonna correct them then and there, say like it's a big meeting and, maybe it's a cross-company meeting and, everything you say actually matters in that moment. There's a way to do this that does not hit the ego. He goes on to say, I believe this for a long time. It sounds noble, but even with the best intentions, correcting people usually fails. And here's the hard part. Don't do it anyway. I'm curious where he goes with this because I could see an angle where this could be a problem, but let's see. People don't see your motivation. They see criticism. They rarely understand why you bothered, and they almost never appreciate it. Worse, most people don't learn from advice at all. They learn from consequences. They have to touch the stoves themselves. Words bounce off, pain sticks. Absolutely, this is some straight fire quote right here. Words mean absolutely nothing when it comes to learning potential, right? This is why I always say watching YouTube videos on how to code or even looking at textbooks, all this stuff is pointless to me. This is the same thing. You can spend 10,000 hours watching somebody do something or reading textbooks. It does not mean anything. You've learned nothing, truly. But if you actually do stuff and you fail, it hits a different level of brainwave, right? That moment you made a mistake, everything is freaking out in your brain. You're thinking, oh shit, like I just made a huge mistake. My entire life is over. Everything's gonna crumble. This is what gets stuff to stick, right? Kind of like the analogy he made about touching the stove. You never touch the stove again later in your life when you had that happen the first time. So you need the oh shit to happen. This is the only way humans can really learn. And he finishes this point by saying, this sounds cold. It is, but also it's true. The most respectful thing you can often do is let people meet their own consequences because that's the only teacher they'll actually listen to. Right? This goes back to what I was saying about the 20 years of experience engineer. He gets this. He knows that I'm gonna have to make this mistake to learn from it. And he always starts with a question. He has me repeat what I said so I can think it back through. Oftentimes I end up changing my direction, by the way, just by speaking it out loud. But this guy gets it. He gets that I will never learn based off of what he tells me. And so it sounds bad to say, right? It does. It sounds bad to say that you're letting somebody go and fail, but it's the right way to do it. You have to let this happen, right? The best managers think this way. They try to prevent a fire, but ultimately they recognize their job is to put out fires, not prevent the fire, right? If they stifle their engineers from experiencing failure, they're gonna end up with some retarded engineers at the end of the day. You need this experience. There's an exception to this. So he does have an exception of when he believes to argue. There's a clean exception to all this, and it flips the entire logic. Help people when they explicitly ask for help. Now, I will question this one a little bit, but let me hear them out. When someone asks, the cause and effect reverse. You're no longer imposing your judgment on someone who never wanted it. They're asking is the cause. You're helping is the effect. Now there's an opening, a real one, because they've decided they're ready to hear it. The ego is lowered. The defenses are down. This advice lands. I don't fully agree with this one because there's a certain expectation when it comes to teams that you're going to ask for peer review, right? When you submit your code, or maybe if you're somebody who's working on documentation, right, you're going to submit that for review. At the end of the day, there's an expectation of peer review, right? There's a good way to give feedback and there's a bad way to give feedback, right? The lay of the land doesn't change much. If I ask this 20 years of experience engineer, hey, I need some help. Can you give me some feedback? The way he delivers that feedback is definitely going to be important here. I have experiences with this person. The way they give feedback is way different than somebody who's new, right? I'll give my perspective on how feedback is typically given at higher years of experience. The 20 years of experience guy, he's gonna say something like this. Can you double check this, right? He's not telling you this is wrong or this is right. He wants you to actually go and investigate yourself and build up these connections that we discussed earlier, the oh shit connection. This is what he wants from you. The new dev, say somebody with 2 years of experience, they're gonna say correct this, right? They're gonna give you a direct, this is wrong, here you go. Whereas a 20-year of experience engineer, he knows, as we've discussed, You're not going to learn from nothing unless you go through this oh shit moment, right? Any feedback you give, you should still make sure you're trying to achieve this part here. And so I think that's important to get across. And so I kind of wish he went in on this part here, you know, when he gives it his everything. I think it'd be good to explain what a good piece of feedback is, and ensuring that you're still making sure that you do not drop the ball on this oh shit moment that is being created here. So we're nearing the end of the article. He does have another point to make. He says, don't win the argument, profit from the difference. If letting go of the argument sounds like pure loss, here's the reframe that turns it into a gain. And actually, before we go into this, I want you to think about the engineers you like most. It's bad to say, but a lot of the people you like the most are probably people that agreed with you at some point and maybe has sided with you in arguments. But it actually goes a little bit deeper than that. A lot of the engineers I like the most are ones that took my feedback and applied it. You recognize this, right? Anytime you've given feedback and you see some change happening, this is a massive freaking dopamine hit, right? Your brain is firing on all cylinders when this happens because you see that this person's actually capable of stifling their ego down and taking in your feedback. And so the reason I bring this up is because being wrong is actually beneficial to your career, right? If you want to get people to like you, and not to say that that's something you should be focused on, but you should realize that taking their feedback and actually applying it actually makes them like you a lot more. And so in your mind, when you're wrong, right, whenever somebody's wrong, they feel some type of way. They feel a negative type of way, right? I think we've all had these moments where we messed up badly at work. You know, hopefully not bad enough to lose your job over, but everyone has had mistakes where they were completely down and out from it. Right? They're thinking about it all night. They couldn't get sleep. You know, maybe it completely ruined their weekend. You know, this happens to everyone. Being wrong freaking hurts, man. It does. But it's a weird phenomenon because in our head, you know, we're going through an absolute war zone. We're thinking, man, I'm an idiot. Everyone looks down on me now. But the reality is actually completely opposite. Because you were wrong, it opened the way for engineers to give feedback. And it opens the avenue where you can actually apply that feedback. And as I alluded to before, the thing that makes us like others is when they take our feedback and apply it. And so oddly enough, by being wrong here, you've actually created a potential to come out ahead. In fact, you could go as far as to say if you were right all the time, you would never have this opportunity. You'd never get to be in a position where somebody gave you feedback or corrected something and you applied it and they liked you for it. And so again, being liked is not the entire end goal. It shouldn't be. But sometimes it's interesting to think about how our mind misleads us, right? Our mind wants us to believe we destroyed the world because it wants us to not make that mistake again, right? The oh shit moment when you touch a stove or when you make a bug in a code, have a bug in the code, that causes us to learn because of this emotion. But so the net positive here is you end up with somebody who likes you more because you actually were able to apply feedback. And then on top of that, you got to actually learn. He goes on to say, when you and someone else see the world differently, you have two options. You can spend your energy trying to convince them you're right, which, as everything above shows, almost never works. Or you can treat that difference as an asset and go build on it. If you genuinely believe something others don't, that's not a debate to win, that's an edge. The market rewards being right in a way that no argument ever will. Instead of persuading the skeptic, ship the thing they think is wrong and let reality settle it. Their disagreement isn't an obstacle, it's your moat. If everyone already agreed with you, there'd be no opportunity left. This is true on so many levels. I want you to think of a few companies. I'll just think of them off the top of my head. Airbnb, LinkedIn, Uber. These are just three that come to the top of my mind. Every single one of these sounds like a terrible idea. Are you kidding me? Airbnb should never work, right? Think about all the bad things that could happen, where people crash houses and the neighbors, homeowner associations, right? There's so many ways that this could go wrong. I know you can see it. LinkedIn, right? Who the hell wants to get their real name out there? And we could see LinkedIn has turned to absolute garbage, but that's not the point here. Each of these companies are companies that nobody thought could work. At one point in time, they thought there was no way. This is too many things could go wrong, but here they are today, right? They succeeded. I often hear something to the effect of this being said, and I think it's honestly so damn true. If nobody disagrees, it's not a good idea. Right? No good idea on this earth was 100% agreed upon. Because if that were the case, everyone would have just done it. Honestly, they sound like terrible ideas, and they still are. You still think about how crazy it is that companies like this are able to succeed. And he goes on to say, this is especially true if you're starting your own company. Differentiation is not a side effect of business, it is the business. A startup exists precisely because its founders believe something the rest of the world hasn't accepted yet. If you could win that argument in a meeting, it wouldn't be worth a company. The entire value lives in the gap between what you see and what others refuse to. So this article is kind of going down into the realm of startup companies and how companies succeed, that kind of a thing. We started off, focusing in on, individuals, how you are tackling arguments, and now we're going into a more company-focused space. So he goes on to say, so I stopped trying to close that gap by talking. I started trying to profit from it by building. Let people disagree. Their disagreement is where the money and the meaning is. He finishes by saying, you can only change yourself. Here's the part that took me the longest to accept. In this world, there is no one you can change. Not your spouses, not your friends, not your kids, and of course, not strangers on the internet. Only yourself. And it's a sad reality too when you think about kids, right? I don't have kids, but I think when you have a kid, you feel like you're melding them, but in reality, you're not. You're just creating the platform for them to have their own ideas and make their own mistakes and learn from those. He says, that's not cynicism, and it's not giving up on people. It's actually the opposite. It's putting your energy where it can actually do something. Every hour spent trying to change someone who didn't ask is an hour stolen from the one person you can change. Now, I kind of alluded to this earlier. I think this is implying that there are people without an ego and people with an ego. I think no matter what, there's an ego hit. And I think it's really just about how you deliver the feedback, right? If you're the smart 20-year-old engineer, you're not going to waste your time spending an hour back and forth. Your feedback, but accept that they're going to go with their own choice at the end of the day. I don't think somebody asking is necessarily a guarantee that this changes anything. Like I alluded to before, there's cases where it's almost obligated to get feedback, right? I think if you're running a company, or even if you're not running a company, even if you're working for a team, there's really always the idea, the customer's always right? This is an idea we always throw around. And so, of course, you're going to ask for feedback even when you truly don't want it. Like, let's be honest, when we ask customers for feedback, it takes a massive ego hit. It really does. Right, every time you ask for feedback, it sucks, man. You're thinking to yourself, they hate it, they're gonna eat you alive. And every time you read a negative comment, it definitely feels some type of way, right? Going back to that idea before of the oh shit moment. And oftentimes you just completely disregard the agrees, right? When a customer comes to you and says, hey, everything's great, you're on to the next customer. You're not worrying about what they're saying anymore, which is unfortunate. I think as human beings, it'd be nice if we actually took positive feedback and, had it contribute to our mood more. Oftentimes we're focused on the disagree part. But when you come and you do this, that sounded weird. When you do this part, you can't be on, if you're being honest with yourself, you might be approaching it with a question, but in reality, you're hoping it's all this. Right? Nobody would build something with the assumption that it's bad and it has things to fix. Everyone assumes and hopes at least that it's correct and they don't get negative feedback. I think even when you're asking for the feedback, it is still the same scenario. You still end up in a situation where you could end up down a freaking rabbit hole of arguments, and the only way to handle it is to realize there's no impact. I've seen this with companies where they'll take customer feedback. Like, if you don't think Microsoft and all these companies are listening to feedback, they are. But their ego, whatever team is working on those features, it's really hard for them to stifle their ego for a minute and make the change. They asked for it. Like, that's the thing. You get all kinds of surveys and suggestions on like, hey, give us feedback to our product. They'll come at you and act like they want it, right? Right? They say, hey, come on in, give us all your feedback. We're listening to every bit. But in reality, they're hoping for this. And when they get this, it's a constant internal argument. Don't think somebody coming to you and saying, give us feedback is even going to help you in that case. It's still the same approach you have to take here. Changing yourself is enough. You don't need to fix everyone else to live well. When you become clearer, calmer, more skilled, more honest, the world around you shifts on its own, not because you forced anyone, but because people respond to who you actually are. Change yourself and you've changed your entire experience of the world. That is sufficient. Nothing more is required. Now he's taking the higher power here, right? He's saying, oh, I figured it out, guys. I'm good to go. He does not need to work on this anymore. Personally, I'm taking the approach of I'm a human being and I'm still going to experience this. I think everyone will still experience this. Reading this article and what I have to say is not going to change that. The right angle here is to just get better at handling it. Kind of how he alluded to earlier, it's important to identify what you are in a position of. Right? If you can identify that you're in that situation, that is the biggest benefit to your entire life, let me tell you. And so he concludes by saying, accept this, and a strange peace follows. The argument falls away. The frustration drains out. You stop trying to win people over, and you start letting them be who they are. I imagine this guy wrote this article, and then he went and he probably argued with his wife or girlfriend. Like, definitely, you cannot tell me that this guy has completely solved everything. Every human being will have this for the rest of your life. So do not try to take this and think, oh, you need to just fix this issue. You're a human being. You're always going to feel this way. This is always going to happen. Trust and believe. At the end here, you should try to be more like the 20-year experienced engineer. Realize that what you say really is not going to impact the end result, but you can set them up for a better moment of failure. Accept that they have to fail to learn, but make sure that they're going into it knowing all well that they are the reason they failed here. And this is very important. This can really change your career. If you can live life in this some ego state, you're going to get way further in your career. Trust me. You'll be surprised if you've ever met with somebody who's high up at your company. You realize they're way down to earth. This is because they lived their life in this state. If they stayed up here, they never succeeded. If they stayed here, they ended up in a better position, right? You would think, oh, someone like Elon Musk or Sam Altman or some major CEO, you would think they'd be here, but in reality, they're here, right? Maybe in the media and the news, it looks like this, but when they're interacting with engineers, they are not up here. They're in this state. They are willing to bend and listen to feedback. If you want to get further in life, keep your humility, accept that everyone has an ego, and do your best to stay here.